where to start. Now, we've been talking about Nietzsche's theory, or rather, as I said last time, Nietzsche's myth about morality, and about the nature of morality, and about the origin of morality. And you remember, as I said, this is not intended to be an abstract theory, and it's not intended merely to be a historical account. It's supposed to be something in between. It's supposed to be a description of repeating patterns, repeating ideal patterns that recur. So they have a kind of individuality that an abstract structure wouldn't have, but they also have a kind of narrative structure of a kind that you find in historical narratives. And as I said, he focuses on two groups of people who are confronting one another. He says you can only understand contemporary morality if you see that the concept of good, which is the central moral concept, is ambiguous. Good can mean that which is opposed to bad, or good can mean that which is opposed to evil, and the ambiguity between those two concepts of good is somehow significant. And so then he begins to think about why it might be the case that the concept of good doesn't have unity, but has this duality within it. And he tells this historical story, which is about two groups of people, a strong oppressing group and a weak oppressed group. So the people he calls masters and the people he calls slaves. The masters, as he says, are healthy, they're active, they have the properties that they have, which they enjoy, they oppress the weak suffer what they must. And now he says, you can see how it would be natural in a situation like that, that is a situation in which there's a confrontation between a systematic group of people who are powerful and a systematic group of people who are systematically not powerful. You can see how it would be natural in that situation for the masters, the powerful people, to see the world in a certain way. They'd see the world as basically good. They were the people who had their trotters in the food bowl. They were the powerful people. They could eat well. They could keep themselves clean. They could oppress the others. And they might then have a word that they would use positively to describe the life they led. And that word would be both descriptive and evaluative. This life that we lead is a good life, and a good life is a life that has certain descriptive properties, and it has certain evaluative properties. In contrast to that, they might describe the life that the weak people live as not good. But to describe it as not good was not morally to evaluate it. It was just to describe the fact that the people who lived the poor life didn't measure up to the standards that the masters thought were appropriate for a good life. So you'd have good, which was a self-description of the powerful, and then you'd have the powerful describing those who didn't lead that life, who failed to one degree or another to lead that life, as being bad. But there was no moral disapprobation associated with being bad. You were just losers. Okay, so that's one origin of the concept of morality. The notion of good, and the notion of a good which is a self-described predicate talking about my experience of myself, my affirmative experience of a life that I myself lead, which I see is good. And I contrast that with one that I don't. But the contrast is a secondary thing. They're weak, they simply fail to lead this life. Now, what about the weak people? What about the slaves? The slaves are in the worst of all possible situations because, of course, they're both oppressed and they have no conceptual apparatus which will allow them to describe their own situation as anything but oppressed. So they both are oppressed and they're incapable of seeing what is happening to them as having any sense at all. Now, Nietzsche says the sense of it is simply that they're weak and they're oppressed. That's the end of the story. They should simply, as it were, face up to that. The reason they're suffering is they're weak. But of course, Nietzsche also thinks that as human beings, we don't have the power, really. We'll do anything rather than admit that the reason we're suffering is that we're weak. That's a thought that's intolerable to us. Because if we're suffering, we at least want to give that suffering some kind of meaning. And so the slaves then engage in this process, which he calls alternatively the slave rebellion of morality, or he calls a transvaluation of values. That is, what they do is they take a concept that the powerful people have, the concept of the good, they take the descriptive content of that concept, they take that over, and they change the sign in front of that descriptive content. So what the life that the masters call good, that is, they describe it in a certain way and they affirm it, they say it's to be praised, the slaves describe and call evil. And they invent a negative term which changes the evaluation of that thing. So this is an archetypical step in the process of what Nietzsche calls a transvaluation of values, or shift of values. You take the content of an existing value, something that's positively valued or something that's negatively valued, and taking the content of that value, you change the sign. What the masters call the good life, the exuberant life of going around and impressing people, that life which the masters enjoy and they describe as good, the slaves redescribe. So it's a kind of redescription. They redescribe it in a way that characterizes it as bad. The masters think it's good to go out and engage in battle and kill a lot of people. The slaves say exactly that is not part of the good life, it's part of a different kind of life, which is the life of evil. And now Nietzsche says this is a way in which the slaves get back at the masters. They can't get back at the masters directly because they're weak. That's the assumption of the myth. They can't get back directly, so they get back in this indirect way by inventing a new concept, the concept of evil, attributing the concept of evil to the life of the masters, and then moving from that to the negation of evil. So the masters start with themselves, affirm themselves, and then describe the slaves as not that. The slaves are focused on the masters. They describe their life as evil. So they're not, in the first instance, describing their own life and going out from that. They're describing the life of the masters. They're rejecting that. And then they negate that life and say, those who don't lead that life of the masters are not evil, therefore good. So you've got good and bad from the point of view of the masters, and you've got evil and not evil equals good on the part of the slaves. Now comes the interesting part. The interesting part is that Nietzsche says to get this transvaluation going, to be able to change the way people look at certain forms of life, it isn't enough simply to invent a new term like evil. That isn't enough. To invent a new term, you have to invent a whole new conceptual apparatus that goes with it. And so what he says is, now, suppose it's a fact that the language the people in this myth speak is like an Indo-European language. Suppose it's a language that has a subject-predicate distinction. That is, it's a language which has the form, John is a student at King's. Roberta is a nurse. It has a subject, it has a predicate position. Now, originally, that's simply a grammatical fact about the language. It's a grammatical fact without any, Nietzsche thinks, without any normal or natural metaphysical implications at all. It's simply an accidental fact about certain languages. What the members of the lower class, what the slaves do, however, is they take this grammatical distinction, the distinction between the subject of a sentence and the predicate of the sentence, they take this grammatical distinction and they metaphysically load that grammatical distinction with significance. So instead of it just being the case that this is a way of categorizing linguistic items, John is a student, instead of being that, it's connected with a metaphysical distinction between a subject who is construed as something like a continuing substance and the activity of that substance. So instead of John runs the marathon simply being a grammatically analyzable thing, you think John refers to some continuing subject who is there. John, he's a separate thing. He isn't just whatever is the object of the grammatical category. He's a substance of some kind. He's got a continuing being. And so there's a substance, and there's an activity that that substance performs. The activity being the activity of running. And so you change the grammatical structure into a metaphysical structure. You have substance and predicate. You have subject and action. And the two of them are construed as different kinds of things. John, Jane, Mary are substances. Running, walking, doing one thing or another are activities. Now Nietzsche says, and then once you've made this metaphysical transformation of the grammatical distinction, you can go on and load that distinction with further properties. Then you can say, for example, the substance who is the subject of these substances are things which are distinct from their activity. John runs at the moment, but John might also not run. Some days he runs, some days he doesn't run. He's still the same John. John is a continuing thing, and therefore you can distinguish that continuing thing from the activities it does or does not engage in. So you see the substance, then, the subject, as suddenly confronted with a set of distinct activities that that subject can or cannot do. That conception is built into the notion of the subject, then, the metaphysical notion of the subject. Then, furthermore, Nietzsche says, once you have that step, you can go another step, and you can say, if John really is different from running or not running, then you can see John as, in some sense, in each case, having to decide whether he is going to run or he is not going to run. Because running is not any longer just part of the essence of what it is to be John. Running is a distinct thing, separate from the substance, and the substance, the subject, stands back and looks at the world and decides then whether he will run or he won't run. I'm Achilles, I'm on the battlefield, am I going to cut this man's head off, or am I not? I stand at the crossroads between a decision between these two activities. Then Nietzsche says, furthermore, you then add to this that therefore the subject has some kind of metaphysical property, which is called the property of free will. So Achilles now suddenly is endowed with this purported metaphysical property, which is the property that says that he can either decide to kill this person or decide not to. That is, the activity is not simply run together with the subject, but the subject is distinct and continuous and has this power to do something or not to do something. Now, you might think that's common sense, but the point of Nietzsche's argument is this is not common sense. This metaphysical view is not implied by the way we think. This is an invention, and it's an invention that's motivated by something. Now, so we've got then this world now suddenly of people who are considered as continuing subjects. There's Raymond, there's Tabitha, there's, well, no, let's leave Tabitha out of it, because we don't want to talk about her free will. She doesn't have any free will. I mean, she has a very simple life, just follow the food. I mean, that's, so there is no, she doesn't sit there and sort of say, shall I have dinner or shall I not have dinner? Shall I pick this up or not? She's just a kind of blur, you know. If there's food there she is with her snout deep in it. So let's stay with human beings. So we've got human beings, they're continuing things, and they do or do not do various things. Then the final nail in the coffin, as it were, is to associate, therefore, with this conception the idea of metaphysical responsibility. That is, if it is the case that I am a distinct person, I'm Raymond, and I'm a continuing distinct subject, and my identity as a continuing existing subject doesn't depend on my doing any particular thing. Every particular thing I'm confronted with is an activity I could or could also not engage in, and if I have free will, which is the ability to choose between these two things, then it's natural to say I can be held responsible for that which I do. If, in fact, I'm Tabitha, I'm not held responsible for eating the food, because there she is, there's the food, she's in the bowl. No distinction. You know, she's a kind of event. Being Tabitha is being an event in the world. It's not being a person in the world. If there's food, there she is with her snout in the bowl. There's no distinction. But if there's me and there's the banana on the table, I can choose it or I cannot choose it, and I have this metaphysical power. Now, Nietzsche then says the notion of responsibility is then associated with this power to choose. If you choose one way or you choose another, and because you can choose one way or choose the other, that choice is something for which you can be held responsible. So what you do is something you do by choice, therefore you can be held responsible for it. Now, that complex of thoughts then gets connected with the concept of evil, right? So the concept of evil starts out as being simply a rejection of the content of the life that the masters live. It's just an unarticulated rejection of that. But it gets articulated through this metaphysical construction, and the metaphysical construction then gives the concept of evil some content. Suddenly, the evil person is a person who has decided to act in one way rather than acting in another way, has used his or her free will in a particular way, and has used that free will in such a way that he or she can be held responsible for it. So you're not necessarily held responsible for being bad or being a failure. The masters think life is like a race. You do your best. Some people come first, some people come last. The ones who come first are good, the ones who come last are bad. No question of responsibility. Everybody does their best. They're just doing it. Some are just not so good. The notion of evil is completely different. The notion of evil is not, some people do this well, some people do this less well. The notion of evil is, you are morally responsible for having done something that has a certain content, and you could have done otherwise, and you decided not to do otherwise, and because you decided not to do otherwise, you can be held responsible for this. Now, this, of course, Nietzsche says, is an enormous transformation in the way people think about morality, because then suddenly, the slaves can see what is actually a natural state and reinterpret that natural state as if it was a decision on their part, right? After all, what does Nietzsche think is actually going on? What's actually going on is the poor are simply oppressed, and the reason they're oppressed is that they're weak, and there's nothing more to be said about that. So the slaves, the fact about the slaves is the slaves are slaves because they're slaves. That's what they are. They're weak. There's nothing they can do. The slaves, however, now have produced for themselves an apparatus which allows them to reinterpret the state of being oppressed, not as simply a state which they find themselves in, but as a form of virtue. Because now, instead of it being the case that we run the race, you win, I don't win, it's that you, the master, stand before the decision. Will you be evil? Will you be good? And you decide. And therefore, I can hold you responsible for being the way you are. I can hold you responsible. Here you are, Achilles out on the field of battle. You're chasing someone, and he goes down. There's famous passages, at the end of the Iliad, where Achilles is chasing this man whom he's already taken prisoner before and sold into slavery. And the man falls on his knees and says, "Oh, please, Achilles, you took me prisoner before, you sold me, here I am back. Do it again. You're such a nice guy." And Achilles says to him, "Look, I'm different now. That was before my friend Patroclus was killed. Now, if I see you, I kill you. Whack. Off you go." Oh, so he kills him. So the slaves say about Achilles, Achilles is not just as he would, as it were, present himself, a kind of killing machine, like Tabitha, I'm Achilles. What I do is kill people. There it is. Get in my way. I'm a kind of lawnmower that's been kind of rogue lawnmower, and the wrong mower. And so there's no question of responsibility. That's who I am. I'm Achilles. I go out and kill people. That's who I am. That's the master's way of thinking about it. The slaves, however, say, no. It isn't that you're Achilles, therefore you kill people. You're Achilles, that is, you are a continuing person who has a kind of integrity in yourself. You are confronted, you have free will, you are confronted at every moment with the choice between these two things. You use your free will to kill this man or not to kill this man, therefore you are responsible for that. And now, okay, that's one thing, but equally notice, the slaves then can say about themselves, we're weak and oppressed, not because that's the way the world is. We're weak and we're oppressed because we have a free will which enables us either to decide to be like the masters or to be not like the masters, and we have exercised our free will so as to be good little boys and girls. So the state of being weak and oppressed is transformed into a virtue. It isn't the case that I'm living this modest life because that's the way the world is. Some people are winners, some people are losers. I belong to the category of losers. It isn't that. All of us who are losers have actually chosen that because we have free will. We could, in fact, have acted differently. We decided to act in this way, and therefore we deserve praise for this. So this is a way of, the full transvaluation of values is only given when you both have the rejection of the existing descriptive content, the change of the change of the sign in front of that, so that what looked good is now bad, and that bad is connected with an apparatus that makes it make sense out of life as a whole, and not just, it isn't just, I reject that, but I reject that, and look, I've got this metaphysical story that I can tell about it, which makes sense of it. So it's really important to see. So the masters, roughly speaking, think that human life, that when I say Achilles kills so-and-so, that is a grammatical statement that has, roughly speaking, the same status as it rains. So if we speak in English, and you'd speak in German and French too, in ways that have these impersonal filler subjects, right? We say, it rains, it snows, il pleut, es regnet. But of course, no one is silly enough as to think that the it rains is like Achilles kills. It rains. There isn't any it that rains. There's Achilles who kills. There isn't any it that rains. The Greeks occasionally said, the Romans actually occasionally said Jupiter rains. I mean, and sometimes, the famous jokes about, Jupiter, raining is Jupiter pissing through a sieve, finding Aristophanes. But actually, it's an impersonal construct where you have a dummy subject. It's raining, it's snowing. There isn't any raining or snowing. It's raining just means the process of raining is taking place. It's snowing just means the process of snowing is taking place. And we describe that process of raining and process of snowing by putting it into the grammatical form in which there seems to be a subject, there seems to be a predicate. But the subject is a dummy. And similarly, somehow, the masters think of the world in that way. They think, as it were, you can say Achilles killed Lokon, but Achilles killed Lokon is just a grammatical structure that has the same standing as it's raining. Achilles killed Lokon because that's the person he is. He's Achilles. He's always that way. He's a master. What is it? So to be a master is to be a being of a certain kind. And only the slaves who introduce the distinction between the subject and the activity and give that metaphysical significance. Now, so it's really important to see that for Nietzsche, the normal way in which philosophers, particularly older philosophers, present their way of thinking about the world is exactly the reverse. It's a mystification. That is, Nietzsche says, in general, if you look at works in philosophy, you'll see that people talk about the metaphysics and they talk about the epistemology. So Plato talks about the theory of ideas, talks about the soul, talks about knowledge of the soul. And when they've got that, when they've got the metaphysics and epistemology, they then move to ethics. Given that the soul has these properties, given that we can know this about the world, then we ought to do this. So the self-presentation of philosophy is a self-presentation in which these metaphysical and epistemological issues are central or basic, and then the ethics is on the top of that. But Nietzsche says what's actually going on there is exactly the reverse. It isn't, as it were, that the metaphysics and epistemology is there, you figure that out, and then you draw some ethical consequences from it. Rather, the whole point of the metaphysics is to satisfy a desire for revenge. The reason we have the metaphysics, why would you be interested in describing the nature of the world and the nature of our understanding of it? Nietzsche says, well, it's clear. The reason you have an interest in that metaphysics is you have the metaphysics of the self in order to hold people responsible. And you want to hold people responsible because only if you hold people responsible can you have the benefits of seeing your own life as having some kind of value vis-a-vis the life of someone else who is stronger. So the motivation of all of this, so what comes first for Nietzsche is not the metaphysics. What comes first for Nietzsche is the desire for a certain kind of self-affirmation, the desire for a certain kind of revenge against those who have irritated us. That desire means that we have a need to hold them morally responsible. So you oppress me. What's really important is I get back at you. How can I get back at you? I can't get back at you if you're stronger than I am, but I can call you evil. I can apply a moral predicate to you. But what do I need to have in order to call you evil? In order to call you evil, I have to have some understanding of what the concept evil means, and the understanding that the concept evil has is an understanding which I can only give you if I develop a metaphysics. So as it were, for Nietzsche, that's why Nietzsche says occasionally, systems of philosophy are forms of private confession, as it were. So it isn't that you start with the very important properties of metaphysics and logic and epistemology, and then you go on to something else. Start from seeing what role these things play in people's lives, what motivates them to develop them and what doesn't. And then you'll see that metaphysics is a late development that's generated by the need of the poor and downtrodden to avenge themselves on those who are stronger. So they need to avenge themselves on them, and they develop this metaphysics in order to give themselves a concept which is a moral concept, the moral concept of evil, so that they can use that moral concept of evil to get a kind of compensatory revenge on those who are oppressing them. So it's really important to see that for Nietzsche, that's why Nietzsche sometimes calls himself the first well, not the first, sometimes calls himself a psychologist. There's one aspect of his work in which he basically wants to replace metaphysics with psychology, although the psychology in question is not the kind of psychology which is the study of attention spans, but it's a psychology that's closer to Montaigne or Dostoevsky than to cognitive. I mean, when he says he's a psychologist, he doesn't mean he's a cognitive scientist, obviously. He means psychology in a different sense. Okay. Now you might say, and it would be very good for you to say, look, this doesn't make sense. This doesn't make sense. Are you telling me really that these people who are members of the master class, or whatever we want to call them, are you telling me really that they had no conception that masters made decisions? Are you really telling me that they thought that that when you say Achilles kills Laocoon, the Achilles there had the same status as it's raining. That's completely implausible. Obviously, they knew that people made decisions. Well, two things to be said about that. One is, of course, they had the grammatical structures that were available for saying that, and they knew that. Second, remember what the status of this discussion is. As I said, this is supposed to be a myth. This is not supposed to be a conceptual analysis in which you have exclusive categories on both sides. What Nietzsche says again and again is master and slave, master morality, slave morality, are more like ideal types. They're like ideal types. That means they can never be fully instantiated in the world. They're like, as it were, a gas that has no friction. We can make some interesting statements about a gas that has no friction. We can say various things about it. We can use that to understand actual gases, but it isn't the case that any gas actually has no friction. So these are two idealizations. So he would say, of course, they knew that Achilles could decide one thing or another. Although you notice that if you look at the way in which they describe decision processes, they are pretty strange. You remember at the beginning of the Iliad begins when Agamemnon takes Achilles' woman away from him, right? Achilles has sacked the city, taken this slave, Briseis, and Agamemnon takes the woman away from him. And then Achilles is about to kill Agamemnon. Because what do you do if you're Achilles and someone takes your woman? You kill them, right? How could there be any doubt about that? And now the slaves would say, but Achilles was a free subject. He decided one way or the other. What Homer says is, the goddess Athena came down from Olympus, grabbed Achilles by his blonde hair, yanked him back, and said to him, Achilles, don't do this. So notice, even in cases which we would be likely to describe as cases in which someone has an inclination to do something and holds back from it, they have an inclination not to say, Achilles stood there and decided what to do, not to say that, but to say, of course, Achilles was going to kill him, but some external thing came down and intervened. So if you look at this, they have a way of describing decision situations, but very often the way of describing it is by external intervention rather than what we would think of as internal processes of deliberation. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, of course, there is no society in which people think of themselves like cats. I mean, there is no society which is so undeveloped that somehow the masters just think, well, I'm Raymond, I'm Raymonding now. The world is Raymonding. There's Raymonding in this room. Of course, there's God. But that's just a sign of the fact that these are ideal types. Second, you remember, Nietzsche says, and this is really important, that there's no known configuration of human life that does not have both masterly and slavely forms in it. So there is no such thing as a pure master morality. There is no such thing as a pure slave morality. They're abstractions. Any particular form of morality will be a particular combination of those analytically distinct moments. So it's, and you remember he says, it's in fact, this is in at the end of the first essay, remember he says, in fact, it isn't just the case that every morality will have components of one, components of the other. It isn't just the case that you'll always find the two of them. You can only separate them by abstraction. It's also the case that higher forms of moral life are forms in which those two things are as highly developed as possible and in as much tension with each other as possible. So in fact, for him, like as everywhere, it's a good thing if you're in a state of tension. So it isn't the case that you're good if you're a pure instance of a master morality, or you're good, roughly speaking, if you're a member of, if you're a good instance of a slave morality. If you're thinking about moral development consists in developing both of those things as much as possible and tolerating or dealing with the tension between the two of them at the same time. So, the normal sort of story that you might hear, that Nietzsche thought we should go back to a world like the world of the ancient Greeks, where where men were men and women were women, and the people killed one another and had no regrets, etc. etc. That's rubbish. Rubbish. There's no trace of that in this theory. The theory has a completely different structure. The masters are stupid, and they're going nowhere. And he says again and again, it's only with the slave revolt of morality that human beings become interesting, life becomes interesting, and we become human. So this is an idealization as part of a mythic story. It's not intended to be a plan for going back to the good old days when we could kill one another, and sort of description of medieval people, simple people disemboweling one another without regrets. That's not the ideal at all. Okay. Okay, now, so at that point, I'm on my page 7 of my handout. Now, there's one more thing I want to mention, two more things I want to mention. First is, note that he emphasizes again and again the contingency of this process. So the fact that Western morality arose out of a struggle between these two ideal typical things, the fact that it arose out of that is not anything like a Hegelian dialectical argument. A Hegelian dialectical argument is an argument that says one particular form carries within itself, by internal logical necessity, a transformation into another one, right? Hegel is very keen on this notion of necessary transformations. If you get Stoicism by an internal dialectic will turn into something else. For Nietzsche, it's contingent. It's contingent that the groups in question stand related to one another as they do. It's contingent that the people in question speak an Indo-European language, or a language with a subject-object distinction. They are contingencies. The form of morality that we have is a contingent result of struggles, historical struggles, between these two tendencies that could have gone differently. So the contingency is a really important point of this, and that's why one of the biggest mistakes you can make is to think about this in parallel to what looks like a similar discussion in Hegel, which is the discussion of the so-called master-slave dialectic. Hegel has a famous discussion in the Phenomenology of Spirit, as you know, which is then taken over by Marx, about the way in which slavery, by an inherent logic, turns itself into something else. And this is not a story like that, because there's no notion of inner logic. Or actually there is a notion of inner logic, but it's not an inner logic that plays itself out endogenously. It's a kind of set of natural propensities that play themselves out in a contingent world in which there are contingent struggles going on, the outcome of which is uncertain. That's the first thing. Second thing is, notice that there's an official view of what's going on here, and then there's the real view of what's going on here. And you'll only understand this if you see that there's a big distinction between the official view that's there on the surface and what's really going on. Namely, you remember, the official view is a dichotomous view, right? The official view is you've got the masters, you've got the slaves, you've got affirmation on one side, negation on the other side, you've got creativity on one side, you've got reaction on the other side, you've got power on the other side, on one side, you've got weakness on the other side. You've got, in short, these four sets of dichotomous divisions that I've written down here. Active, spontaneous, as opposed to reactive, affirmative, negative, greater power, lesser power, genuinely creative, not creative. Now, the official story wants to identify all four components on each side. That is, the official story wants to say the masters are affirmative, creative, have power, etc. slaves are negative, reactive, weak, etc. And those two columns collapse. So they line up naturally. That's the official story. However, if you see what he actually says in the text when he describes what happens, you'll see that the official story cannot be right, because the whole point of the story is that the slaves are weak, but in one sense, at one point they are creative, right? So the simple official story is for masters. The masters are creative, they affirm themselves, they're not dependent on anyone else, they're self-sufficient, they're powerful, they're affirmative. The slaves are not powerful, they can't create anything, they're weak, etc. However, the actual analysis shows the reverse of that. The actual analysis shows that in this particular situation, the original creation comes not from the masters, but from the slaves. The slaves invent a new concept, namely evil. That's what Nietzsche says, basically, is the central event in Western morality is the invention of the concept of evil. That's the thing that really gives us room to go. Evil and all the things you need in order to have the concept of evil. So evil associated with the appropriate metaphysics, the appropriate epistemology, the appropriate notion of free will, etc. That is a genuine invention. It's not an invention of the masters. It's an invention of the weak. Second, remember, the masters are supposed to be centered in themselves, and they're supposed to be affirmative. And affirmative, not depending, therefore, on the slaves. The slaves are supposed to be reacting against the masters. But remember that Nietzsche also holds the doctrine which we talked about, which is the doctrine of the so-called pathos of distance. That is, Nietzsche also thinks that you can be creative only if you have an internal tension in yourself which distinguishes you from other people. That is, if you see yourself as inherently belonging to a rank ordering that's superior to the rank ordering of someone else. You remember we talked a little bit about slavery, right? Aristotle says we have to have slaves in order to have the work done. Nietzsche says we have to have slaves in order to have someone to despise, right? So the masters are supposed to be self-affirming, purely self-affirming, and not dependent on the slaves. But if you look at the actual story is the masters would only be able to be affirmative in the way they are if they are distinguishing themselves from the slaves as the people to look down on and despise. How do the masters know their good life is a good life? Well, partly it's self-affirmation, but partly it's this. So, furthermore, who are the weak people and who are the strong people in this model? The masters are supposed to be the strong people, the slaves are supposed to be the weak people. But, as Gibbon said, what does strong and weak mean? Strong and weak can mean two different things. Strong and weak can either be phenomenally and phenomenologically described. That is, I'm strong if I actually get what I want, if I actually am able to do what I need to do. The concept of strength and of weakness is a mere descriptive concept. The only way you can tell who's strong and who's weak, you put them in the ring and one of them knocks the other one out. And the one who knocks the other one out is stronger and there's nothing more to be said about it. Everything else, remember, would be mysticism. The alternative might be, okay, you put me in the ring with someone else and I might knock him out accidentally, or whatever. That is, there's some notion of strength which is not simply reducible to what happens, but it's an internal property that I have, an internal property that might not be expressed. So, roughly speaking, is strength an internal property that you can't see, that might be expressed or might not be expressed, or is strength just whatever happens? Now, if you take the view that strength is not just whatever happens, but it's this kind of internal structure, that itself is a result of the slave's conception of an internal life that's independent of what happens, right? If you're a master, you think what a Achilles does, and there's nothing more to be said, just as Tabitha is as Tabitha does. Tabitha is as Tabitha eats. Achilles is as Achilles kills. There's nothing more to be said about it. To say something more about it, to say there's something inside Achilles, which might or might not express itself in an appropriate way, is to go over to the slave's point of view. So if you take the internal structure view of the will and power, you're on the slave side already. Similarly, if you ask who really won this confrontation, Nietzsche says, look at Europe. It's full of Protestant church, it's full of Christian churches. Christianity won. If winning means who actually got the predominant position. So how weak can the slaves actually have been if they're the ones who are running the moral world? So after all, Nietzsche's whole assumption, right, is that the modern moral world is a combination of a lot of different things. As we said, one of them, the most important one, is Christianity. That's the most important for Europe in the 19th century. Most important was Christianity. So Christianity seems to be the strongest thing. In 2,000 years, who ended up on top? The Roman Emperor or the Pope? Well, the Pope ended up on top, right? As opposed to the Roman Emperor. So the notion, too, that weakness and negation are connected to each other doesn't survive. So whichever way you cut the pie, the official view doesn't give you what you want. It isn't the case that the weak are always just reactive, never able to get what they want, etc., and the stronger affirmative and have more power. So the actual account shows that the official view, which Nietzsche sometimes formulates when he's not being very careful and he's just sort of playing around, really isn't the right kind of thing. So anyway, that's I think that's a really important thing. Now, the nature of this text, of course, is that it's in 3 parts. So there's a first essay, there's a second essay, and there's a third essay. And now, in the 5 minutes that are left to me, I'd like to begin to talk about the relation of the first essay, which is this essay about the generation of the concept of evil. So the first essay is about how the concept of evil even gets going. And then there's a second essay and a third essay. Now, it's really important to see that the second essay does not continue in any historically continuous way from the first essay. This is not a book in which you have a history that's told sequentially. It's a series. That's why it's described as a series of Abhandlungen, a series of treatises that are distinct. The first one talks about evil. The first one talks about good and bad, good and evil, how the concept of evil gets invented, how the concept of a dual notion of good gets established. The second talks about a distinct strand. This is part of Nietzsche's general view that, as it were, history operates by putting distinct strands of things together. That is, the one thing Nietzsche detested was what he thought of as origin stories, right? That is, stories that have the structure that the present is understood as the result of something going back to an individual origin. So his example of this is something like Christianity, right? So you have Jesus in Palestine in the period just before and just after the turn of time, and as it were, he is an absolute origin. He's a null point. He's an absolute origin, and Christianity then is represented as a series of deviations or developments of that. So you get Orthodox Christianity, you get Catholic Christianity, you get Protestant Christianity, but you're all going back to this null point, which is the point of absolute origin. So, as I said in the beginning, remember, think about it in parallel to the case that I talked about in the very beginning when I talked about a manuscript. We've got these manuscripts of Cicero, and they've all been recopied. But back at the beginning, there's one archetypal manuscript of Cicero, which is the one that he dictated to his slave Tyro. There's one source of meaning back there that's the origin of all of this. And of course, that's the way Nietzsche thinks most Christians think about this. They think about their morality going back to Jesus. And now Nietzsche's thought about history is exactly the reverse of that. That is, he says, if you think about history, don't think about history as going back to some single initiating moment, which was completely meaningful. You know, there's absolute Christianity in the life of Jesus, or there's the absolute revolutionary potential in the Bolshevik Party in 1918, and then it falls off from that. Or there's this real origin here of meaning, and it all falls off from that. Rather, history is a process in which different strands come together and get put together. So that rather than the present down here rather than our being encouraged historically, starting from the present, to go back to the real, genuine origin of things, we should rather see ourselves as at the culmination of a variety of different strands of things, which were originally distinct and only came together recently. So if you look in Christianity, don't look back for this aboriginal Christianity in Jesus, which then gets deviant. Look at various different forms of ascetic practices that were originally, ascetic practices and beliefs and this, that, and the other, that originally had nothing to do with each other. And they come together. The Apostle Paul puts together these things from Judaism, these things from Greek philosophy, these ascetic practices. Those things didn't inherently have anything to do with one another. He put them together. So his view of history is, the further back in his, so the Protestant view is, the further back, the closer you get to the aboriginal Christian message. You'll get back to the real Christian message. Just go back far enough. And Nietzsche says, no, it'll get more and more meaningful and less degenerate. Nietzsche says, no. If you go back, the further back you go, the more different things you'll find, and the more different strands you'll find, which originally were historically connected to completely different things, and were accidentally brought together in this context. So as you look back, the past will dissolve into a variety of different paths, and your task as a historian then is to understand these variety of different paths. And the three essays in the genealogy of morality are three discussions of such individual paths back. They're not a single unilinear story. They're not a single story going back. They're three different lines, and what he's saying is those three different lines had different origins, different contexts, and they only get put together historically. So the next time I'll talk about the second of these essays, which is an essay about guilt and debt and owing things, and then try to see how the concept of evil and the concept of debt, guilt, and owing things get together eventually. But they have to be brought together. They're not naturally together. So the idea is the original notion of guilt has nothing to do with morality. That's what he's trying to claim. The original notion of guilt has something to do with repaying debts in commercial transactions and various things associated with that. It's completely different in its origin from the idea of evil. It's only Christianity that accidentally puts together that notion of debt and that notion of evil and generates a particular kind of conscience. Okay, so that's what we'll talk about next time. Okay.